Shawn Michaels, A&E Biography. Did you get to see it?
I did get to see it. Yeah.
What did you think just overall in terms of, with Shawn Michaels? I think that they went into a lot of areas that I kind of expected them to. It's always interesting when they, like in WWE in particular, their code words for a lot of this stuff, it's demons and partying. But they did get more specific in this.
I felt like they didn't really kind of rely on the code words too much. I mean, Shawn Michaels was very blunt about doing a lot of blow slash yayo, which
Yayo.
he would often say, which I thought was awesome.
And in Continental would get his $100 payoff where he could get $50 and then $50 in blow. That 9 times out of 10, he would take them up on that exchange.
We even had like the, I guess, stock footage of like lines of coke being divvied up, like you would see, and then like superimposed over top of it.
I think they, yeah. So it's always great when they can dig into the stock footage.
I felt like this was the best one they've done. It to me
Really?
presented, yeah. Well, I think it's kind of slim pickings, honestly, about like what else there is. But of the A&E biographies, I like this one the most. I thought it presented what felt like a pretty honest, yet obviously very abridged look at Shawn's past faults and subsequent transformation.
They tried to cover a lot in the 2 hours. Like they, it's a pretty expansive career and they did try to hit on everything. Like the Montreal stuff, I'm not even going to get into. Like
it wasn't overbearing.
No,
like,
it wasn't. Like they kept it short. It's still the old, whatever. Like you can get into your philosophy behind all of it, but I like that they kept it relatively small in the whole thing. I mean, it was what, 5-6 minutes?
Oh yeah. Like, and when you think about the context of his entire career, that is not an incident that necessarily defines him. I imagine for Brett, it'll probably take a bit more time because I think, unfortunately, it seems to define Brett a whole lot more than it seems to define Shawn. But I felt like there was some pretty good coverage of all the major incidents in his career. You have to remember these A&E biographies. They're not necessarily like a Dark Side of the Ring that kind of like tries to investigate a specific incident. This is more just a general Wikipedia overview of the main events of this person's career to somebody who might be familiar with Shawn but doesn't know all this stuff, or maybe somebody who doesn't know who Shawn Michaels is whatsoever. In 90 minutes, you can know, okay, what is the barbershop window? What is Syracuse? What is losing your smile? They covered all these things, I thought, like in pretty succinct and like pretty good fashion. I didn't feel like there were any kind of like crazy selections of talking heads in this one, like there was in previous episodes. Felt like everybody who was chosen for the show was a relevant voice.
Yeah, I thought you got some, one of the like main things you come out of this, I don't want to say necessarily sorrow, but it's like somewhat you just feel sad that this guy had, like he very much is open about the fact that in his career, like the first half of his career, it's literally all this guy has. It's just, he comes up from like a very like, doesn't have like a problem upbringing, has a wonderful family, but he gets into this industry and finds success immediately. Like he's in Mid-South. That's his first territory at 19. And by 21, like he's gone to Kansas City in Central States. He's on ESPN for the AWA at 21. Like he's just rising up very quickly. And then he gets almost immediately, he's into the pills, he's into the partying. And he's so dependent on it. And he had no life outside of pro wrestling. And it just seemed like a very hollow existence that he lived that only escalated as his talents grew, his exposure grew, and his bank account grew at such a high level. But this was a very empty human being until the late 90s.
Mm-hmm. Something I don't often think about when it comes to like Shawn Michaels and his championship run in the mid 90s is that like, I mean, people often talk about Kevin Nash being a poorly drawing champion, but I mean, in many ways, I felt Shawn was, kind of admittedly here, like a failed champion with the company, not really able to kind of handle that sort of weight on his shoulders, and even reluctant to, give it up by the end. So he is a great in-ring performer, and I think we all like love the '90s Shawn Michaels. But I mean, certainly mentally, this really highlighted that he was not ready for that spot and ended up, retiring. I mean, because of his body, but you have to wonder how much like his lifestyle and everything else would have played into his early retirement at the age of 33.
I think you have to just throw it out there that had he not had that back injury, was he going to make it? I think that's a very relevant question to ask, because this is a guy that was spiraling. Like, it sounded very much like the final days of Brian Pillman. Like, that's how dark this guy's life was getting by 97, early 98, and is just living off of pills. His body is breaking down. Like, remember, at the time he walks away in 98, he's 32 years old. Mm-hmm. Which is, sorry, by the way, is right around the same age Pillman has the Humvee wreck. Like, you're talking about very young athletes that are facing like the rest of their lives potentially, and their bodies are breaking down and obviously would have completely different outcomes. But that's what Shawn is facing. Here's a guy that is dependent on prescription drugs. His body is breaking down, and his future is looking very bleak in 1998.
Mm-hmm. I thought, the documentary really highlighted how much of a personal caregiver Triple H was for him during those periods, with Hunter specifically saying like part of his routine every night was to make sure that Shawn would get up to his hotel room. He would like make sure that like he put him into bed and then set his alarm for every few hours to check on him to make sure that he wasn't dead, basically. And that really kind of shows you how alarming his state was, and to be given that level of responsibility in a company at a time when the man can barely be helped to like be kept alive, I think is pretty. Here's the thing: is like I wasn't sure how much they were going to go into all of this, because it's one thing for let's say Savage, to like be high on an episode of Nitro, but this is WWE and they're world champion in this state on their own watch, and you kind of have to like. They don't place blame on Vince, and they don't place blame on the company.
Vince literally has that line where he said he was okay in our environment. He was protected. It was outside of our environment. Like, what does that mean? Because this guy is a mess. And you go back to the Dark Side of the Ring episode, and what is it that Brian Pillman is his breaking point in his relationship with Jim Ross? It's when they are so concerned with him that they put him through a drug test, rightfully so. But his argument was, I'm hardly the only guy that's a mess here. And when you have Shawn that you are sharing a locker room with, I can see that double standard and being furious that I'm being singled out, whereas Shawn is, in theory, getting a free pass that the locker room is seeing, because this guy is falling apart as well.
Yeah. So I felt like, you kind of have to draw your own conclusions, but I felt like it pointed the finger at a WWE work environment a lot more than maybe some of the other documentaries have thus far in this A&E series. But, because this has such a strong redemptive story, perhaps they feel willing to be able to go into that territory, because the second half of his career, of course, is I mean, it's arguably better than his first. I think many people say, and certainly, he does appear to be a very different person than he was the first time. And then it kind of gets into like even the third stage of his career at this point now, where you get to see a lot of backstage footage of him working with NXT talent over the past year. And it really kind of makes it look like he is very much at peace and excited about what he's doing today at the Performance Center.
Yeah, you kind of get those kind of three different viewpoints of Shawn Michaels in his professional career, like the first run, the second run, and modern day. And, it is a really remarkable story when you see it, because you look at Shawn through 98, 99, it's like, it would be stunning to believe that this guy was going to make it to this degree. Like, it really is unbelievable what he was able to turn around, and deserves a lot of credit for that, to be able to drop that addiction that he had. I thought it was a pretty chilling comment that Paul Levesque shares of whether it was meant seriously, half seriously, or in jest, was the remark Shawn made that had he just like overdosed on pills after WrestleMania 14, he would be viewed as a legend. Like that's a pretty scary state of mind to be in. And I mean, they did kind of focus on that earlier in his career when him and Marty are fired immediately in 87 and they're down in Continental and Shawn is messed up on all this stuff and he is contemplating suicide. Like that is how much this guy was reliant on professional wrestling and thinking that at the age of 22, my shot at the World Wrestling Federation was done and my career has peaked already in my early 20s when he's 3 years into this.
Mm-hmm. When you consider all of that and then you go on to see, the great run he would have later on, and the ability to just strictly focus on the art and ignore the rest of that bullshit, like it is a, very heartwarming, enlightening story.
Did you find it interesting, the analysis that even today, Shawn acknowledging that his level of creativity and to get to a point of being fearless as a performer, he does not think he could have reached those heights without this reckless lifestyle. I found that to be really interesting and probably like a very honest answer that you look at a lot of quote unquote tortured artists that is their, like it is that element that it does produce art at the same time. And he's saying like, I could not have reached this level to push myself without that at the same time. I found that to be very interesting and self-reflective.
It is interesting, yeah. Nobody would really know the answer to that except him. But certainly physically, I think like he would have been that either way. Would he have had the attitude that, would have attracted people, maybe attracted Vince McMahon to put the belt on him and to make him the top guy? Well, who knows? I mean, certainly the Heartbreak Kid character seems like a very much an extension of like who the guy is. And if he was as mellow as he is today back then, wearing the camo hat and like the jeans, would he be as over as he was in the 90s? I don't know.
What have you thought seeing he's been in all of these A&E pieces? I've been disappointed with Vince McMahon, just that it's, I don't know what his recollections are, how clear of a memory he has, but it's very basic stuff that Vince McMahon is providing. And I think for someone, the level of notoriety of having Vince McMahon in your documentaries, it just feels like it's very surface level, like the most surface level. To me, if he wasn't Vince McMahon, this would be stuff I'd be cutting from the episode, to be honest.
Well, the issues introduced thus far, I would say, largely aren't necessarily confrontational to Vince himself. I'm trying to think like of the episodes that we've seen, how much of the finger was like, did Vince have to answer for? It doesn't even get into it with the Montreal Screwjob here because they didn't even present his side and
just his role as like mediator / provocator involving Brett and Shawn. He's in the midst of this, like essentially pulling the strings of these two very high-strung individuals. I mean, there's a lot of interesting dynamics at play there, and I just think we're getting, you just don't get much beyond surface level with Vince McMahon, and that just, to a further point, you look at the documentary series they're creating on Vince McMahon, how much of that is, I think people are so enamored with the idea of a documentary series on Vince McMahon with the belief that this guy has done and seen everything. But how much of that documentary series is going to be relied on other talking heads versus Vince McMahon himself? I don't know.
Well, I really have to imagine, because it's an entire series focused on the man, that you can't just talk about the highlights of the man's life. If you're doing a 90-minute show, I can understand doing something like, what we saw with the Shawn piece, which is very, relatively surface level. Hey, here are the highlights of the man's career. Any sort of controversial aspect will kind of weave. Even with Shawn, though, like they talk about the controversies in his life, and Vince McMahon is not somebody who has lived without any controversy, obviously. So in the span of an entire series, I would have to expect that you would get some of that, warts and all type of presentation.
Yeah. Overall, I would say this. If you ever read Shawn Michaels' book, which came out about 15 years ago, it's shortly after his comeback. We're only a few years into the return. There's a lot of, the same stuff covered in both, but this version of Shawn in the documentary, I think, is a much more grounded, reflective, taking ownership of his mistakes version, because even in the book, which is, again, after his comeback, still very defensive, very much putting blame elsewhere, really comes off as someone that it's very rare that you read an autobiography where the person becomes unlikable at times, but he does in this book. Taking a lot of pot shots at Brett in the book, very dismissive of, newsletter coverage of himself, pretty much any coverage of himself. It was pretty much, he would talk about all the criticisms, like, refusing to do jobs. He would say, there's no such thing as refusing to do a job. But then he'd always couch things with, did this happen? Yeah, but I was just trying to poke people. I was just trying to poke the bear. It was like he was acknowledging that he did these things, but, it was just taken the wrong way. It just wore thin in the book for me. Whereas this version, it feels like a much more mature Shawn Michaels.
Well, were there instances in this documentary where you felt like some of those things were answered in a different way? Like, for instance, the whole losing his smile bit. What was your kind of takeaway after watching this?
His story has always been the same, is that he went to a doctor in San Antonio, and his doctor, who I guess does not specialize with like athletes, which is a different, type of analysis, like, examining random person off the street versus high level intense athlete, and saw that Shawn Michaels, he had no ACL left, and he had been working without an ACL for years, and said, you can't ever wrestle again. And Shawn took this as gospel, got a second opinion after the losing my smile speech, which, I mean, Shawn is a mess by this point just in terms of the whole schedule and the drug use, but gets the second opinion from Dr. James Andrews, who is the guy that WWF sends all their people to, and just like, you can just wear a knee brace, you'll be fine. Like, you don't even need surgery. But there was so much to that of Shawn was scheduled to lose to Brett at WrestleMania. It was a very convenient way out of WrestleMania, which you can argue was for the best for the company, because the backup plan ended up getting Austin that match with Brett that was of significant importance to the company. But I mean, Brett has just always believed like there was more at play than what Shawn was alleging, but Shawn it could be a case of both being true, that a doctor gave him this prognosis, and that was a very convenient way out of this, of working that WrestleMania with Brett.
Yeah, the man has lived a very interesting life, and therefore I thought it made a pretty interesting 90 minutes here. It's not going to be as in-depth as something like a book, or it's not going to focus on a specific issue like Montreal or Wrestling with Shadows, but for a concise 90 minutes, if you are a Shawn Michaels fan and kind of want to relive his entire career in that span of time, or introduce him to somebody who doesn't really know Shawn, I thought it was really well done.
What did you think about how they covered the return in Saudi Arabia?
I don't think that exists.
WrestleMania 2010, my swan song, much like Ric Flair's was in WrestleMania 24 on this documentary as well. The final matches for each individual. But that was the Shawn Michaels A&E biography, and I guess next week is the main event with the Ultimate Warrior.
Yeah, judging by the previews, I mean, it does look like they will talk about the man's faults. We will see how they present them, and we'll see what sort of redemptive story that they're able to tell for Warrior.